Good evening. Marhaba ya Qatar. It's my pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Lamia. You see what great students we have here. We're so proud of them. Thank you also, Mehran, for inviting me to talk a little this evening. We tried to pick as big a topic as we could. So there isn't much that doesn't fit into wealth and power in the new world order. Let me begin by warning you of two things. One is that I'm not really this tall. I'm standing on a box. We have a tradition at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. that derives from former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who, like me, is short. She's even shorter than I am. We have the Madeleine Albright box that we have ready behind every podium, and she and I share it. Almost nobody else needs it. This is actually an excessively tall Madeleine Albright box, but I'm happy to be standing here looking a lot taller than I am, and at least I can see you, and you can see me. The second thing is I'm going to do a PowerPoint, so there is no written speech, but if you have an interest in the PowerPoint, that I think is what Mehran meant as being up on the website. So let us begin. My basic message today is that we're living, all of us, in a slow-moving and fundamental transition in wealth and power in the world, involving changes in the distribution of wealth, a redefinition of power, and challenges to world order. Now that raises some interesting problems, which I'm going to elaborate. What I don't have are solutions to those problems. I think probably it's Lamia and her generation that are going to have to deal with these problems, struggle with them as we have struggled with problems in our world, and we hope that we're providing the education to some of these young people that will carry us through to a bright future. What are our questions? First of all, what was the old world order like? The second question is what changes have occurred that have contributed to a different world today? And the third question is with what consequences for power and wealth and order? So what about the old world order? It was state-centric. States were the major actors, often the sole international actors, with power and often the ability to exercise that power to affect events. We can actually go back to the Treaty of Westphalia many hundreds of years ago that marks the beginning of the state-centric world order. There were two superpowers, we all remember them, the United States and the Soviet Union. There was the rich North and the poor South. The end of the old world order I would mark in 1991, although you can use any manner of dates to identify it. 1991 is when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was beginning to fall apart, I would have to say, already in the 1980s. Other things were happening at the beginning of the 90s, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that was really, I think, the time that marks the beginning of real change. Gorbachev said something interesting, at least I think he said something interesting, because I remember it, but when I looked it up to get a source as I was putting this presentation together, I couldn't find it. So I may have made this up, but my memory tells me he said, "You will miss us when we're gone." And we do. We miss the clarity and the certainties that made the old world order if not bearable, at least understandable and often predictable. And you see the great former Soviet Union, the largest country in the world of its time, that has now become many countries. A second thing that I mentioned is the change in the division between the rich North and the poor global South. There's been some real progress in growth in the South, even though there's still 2 billion people or more living on less than $2 a day. But let us not forget the progress that we've seen, and I want to show it to you. So we're going to have a little fun here, if I can pull this off. I'm going to go to a website that some of you may know called Gapminder. Gapminder is an interactive website that I think, the creator of TED, that other interesting website, made several years ago. What we're looking at here is the world in 1800, and we have a graph that, as you see, on the vertical axis is life expectancies in years, and on the horizontal axis, per capita income. And you can see which countries we're talking about. If you're interested in Africa, the blue countries are flashing. If you're interested in North America, we have some of those too. Let's see what's happened. I might add, by the way, that we're looking at the United Kingdom in those days with an average life expectancy of 40 years. Where is Ted Lancaster? Ted, are you here? He's way in the back. Ted has the same last name as I do, but he spells it wrong. I bet he's surprised that life expectancy was so low. But good things have happened since then, and let's watch them. Okay, so we're moving forward here. That little bouncy country there that keeps going up and down is Sweden. I don't know what was going on in Sweden in those days. Either they had very bad statisticians or they were having problems with war and disease. Anyway, we're moving, and it's in such an obvious direction that we have to celebrate this direction as we move forward. Life expectancy is going up dramatically, and so is income, until we finally get to 2007. Unfortunately, this does not show our recent experience with the financial crisis, but I would like to think that's a temporary one. Now, you can guess which countries are which, I think. So the really big one, whoops, it's not Syria, it's China. And the next really big one is India. You won't be surprised that I'm going to point to the United States. Ireland is inside the United States, as you notice. Or maybe we're inside Ireland. I can't figure out which. Now, what do you think this little guy out here on the extreme right is? Anybody want to guess? You looked. It is Qatar. Something good is going on in Qatar because it's got more income than anybody else. So we celebrate that. Anyway, the point of this little exercise is to show you how much progress has taken place. Yes, we still have a cluster of countries that are many of them poor in sub-Saharan Africa, but they've come along. They need to come along further. And I think we see the diversity of where countries are. I can show you, I don't know if I can divide all of these, but here we have Asia. Asia is strewn out. The point here is not only that there's been progress, but that progress has been enough in some parts of the world so that the old names of the rich North and the poor South are no longer relevant, that we have a much more diverse world. So that's another big change we're living with. And I have to get rid of that. If I press the right one, I got it. A really important thing, and all of us live this every day, is the increasing integration of many states into the global economy. Qatar, of course, very integrated. It's dependent, obviously, in many ways on the export of oil. The United States, which used to be quite independent of the world economy, going back 30, 40, 50 years, a small percentage of the US economy was dependent on trade. That's no longer the case. We are very dependent on trade, as many, many other countries are. The thing I mentioned already, the erosion of the reality of a third world, which was a political reality that died with the end of the Cold War, but the economic reality has also eroded. It's a fourth world and a fifth world and a sixth world. And I have to mention, and I'll come back to it temporarily, inshallah, the setback that we've experienced in the last year, which in many ways is the most dramatic indication of the integration of the world that I think we could have imagined, beginning in the United States and spreading throughout the world. I must tell you a little, and everybody knows it, where it began and how it spread. I must tell you a little personal story. Several months ago, I was in China, and I went to one of those inexpensive Chinese markets. I think we have some music here. Inexpensive Chinese markets, and I was bargaining for a couple of scarves. You know, I shouldn't have been bargaining for a couple of scarves. You know how you get into the bargaining thing and you can't stop. I mean, this is where bargaining was invented. And it was really, we were bargaining in the Chinese currency, which came up to a couple of cents here and there. But I bargained and bargained and bargained, and finally the merchant, a woman, said, "You Americans, you started the world financial crisis, and now you won't even buy from us for a fair price." So I'm still feeling guilty about that. Not only did we start it, but we keep it going. Hopefully it will be temporarily a passing thing. What has led to these changes? I was lucky and managed to find some symbols on the internet. You can see technology as a computer chip or set of chips. And I don't know how many of you feel that you're living a revolution, but I feel I'm living in one of the most exciting revolutions in human history, the technology revolution. And I don't even pretend to be able to keep up with it. It seems to me to really be on the cutting edge of the technology revolution with all the amazing things that have been invented and are now on the market, you have to probably be under 21. Lamia, is that true? We sit around at Georgetown sometimes thinking, how do these young people think? They tweet. We don't even know what a tweet is. Or some of us don't know what a tweet is. But that's one of the many things that we have. I have two personal experiences that are amazing to me as a result of technology as a scholar. I wrote a book, co-authored a book with a colleague of mine who is a professor in Dar es Salaam. Now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, any of you who are familiar with Africa, for that matter, Latin America and many other places, know that forget it about writing a book together. The mails would go back and forth, and maybe they'd arrive and maybe they wouldn't. But he and I did this on the internet, and we never had to get together. I've actually written a paper with an Egyptian woman for the World Bank whom I'd never met. I still haven't met her, but we did this paper together. Now that is kind of a small thing, but it's marked my life, and I think all of us probably have those kind of experiences. I carry around a Kindle. I don't know how many of you know what a Kindle is. I'm sure you must know the Amazon e-reader. I must have 25 or 30 books in that Kindle, which always goes dead on me on these international flights because I forget to gas it up before I leave. But just the idea of carrying a library with you. I could go on, and you could also go on too. Education. If you look at international educational statistics worldwide, you will find, even in the poorer countries, or at least most of them, the ones that haven't suffered from conflict lately, educational achievements have been going up. In fact, in Latin America, you have more than 100% of the eligible age group in primary school and increasing numbers in secondary school. And in sub-Saharan Africa, those numbers have been rising rapidly too. And capacity. And here I have to share with you something that has occurred to me as I've traveled the world in the last 30 years. and lived and functioned in many developing countries. It's what I call the elevator theory of development. If a society can use and install and manage elevators effectively, they have crossed a line of capacity. One of the places I lived many years ago, was La Paz, Bolivia. At a time when La Paz and the whole country was very poor. It's still very poor. Elevators were important in La Paz, Bolivia, because the altitude is 3,500 feet, and so nobody walks upstairs, especially not foreigners who haven't ever adjusted to the scarce oxygen. There were no reliable elevators in La Paz, and so buildings were low. Now, as I go back to La Paz, I've been going back and forth over the years, there are many tall buildings, apartment houses and hotels and so on, and the elevators work. Something has happened in Bolivia. It's something to do with organization and capacity. There are still places in sub-Saharan Africa where I would not take a risk on an elevator. There is a capacity thing here. I can't go further than that, and nobody seems to think this is a very important theory, but it does mark something that is happening in many developing countries in the world, has happened, and I think it marks a real change in capacity. Political stability. We think often that we live in a time when there are many conflicts in the world and that conflicts are growing. We hear about Darfur, we watch the collapsed state in Somalia, and on. But actually the data show that the number of conflicts, civil conflicts in particular, have declined since the early 90s. And we know that many have been resolved, or at least have been pieced over, if you like, we can't deny the destructiveness of the conflicts, but something also seems to be happening, at least at present, with many of these conflicts often being resolved. And that, of course, helps in the development of the countries that have been suffering. So what we find, I think, is a growing prosperity, particularly in the 90s, worldwide, that is both an effect and a cause. It is an effect of some of these other phenomena, and also a cause of further possibilities for education, for the use of technology, and for prosperity and political stability. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a deconcentration of wealth. That is the change in the distribution of wealth. I want to show you that in a minute. A redefinition and decentralization of power, and an increased potential for disorder, even though civil conflicts have decreased in number. Let's look at the spread of economic wealth. I dug out some data before I came. And what you see is, first of all, to the left is a graph of the growth in world gross domestic product from 1990 to 2008, which is really quite striking. These are current dollars, but it doesn't matter, it's percentage. It's really quite striking, particularly in the decade of the 90s. What may be more interesting is I'm sorry, that's on the left. What may be more interesting is the graph on the right, which shows that in this experience of growth, the G5 grew less rapidly than the rest of the world, so that the percentage of gross domestic product worldwide for the G5 has been going down. Now, we know, of course, that two countries have contributed to that, one in particular, and that is China, and you can see the dramatic rise in gross domestic product in China. And I don't know, maybe many people in this room have been to China. I have, over the last couple of years, been quite often, and I found it breathtaking, the changes in China. And it's astounding. But India is coming along too. Another interesting graph is the one on the bottom, which I think is particularly telling. The G20, the ones that just met in Pittsburgh, that includes the larger, richer countries of Europe and Japan, and even Canada and Italy, as well as what we call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, even in this case, their proportion of gross domestic product worldwide has been going down. And I think that says that wealth has been decentralizing, even as it's been growing. Obviously, one of the drivers, I'm not going to go through all the drivers, you don't need an economics lesson from me, and I'll probably get it wrong anyway, but one of the drivers is world trade. And this, I think, is a very dramatic demonstration of not just a driver for growth, but integration, economic integration worldwide. If we could take this out, I looked for more up-to-date data, I didn't find it, I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but if we could take this out to 2008, I think we'd see an even more dramatic increase. And then in 2009, I think we'd see a dip. But growth in world trade is obviously extremely important, especially manufacturers. And that links to China as well. What about the decentralization and redefinition of power? Something about being integrated, something about being dependent on other people spreads power. You do things to others that affect you. If you do bad things, they can affect you adversely. And I think that is an important aspect of the world we live in. And you can think about how very vulnerable we are as well with the dependence of the world, interdependence of the world. I mentioned earlier the financial crisis, it seems to me, is a very, very good indication of how interdependent we are financially. I'm sure those of you who work in the financial area are aware of how close we came on the occasion of the collapse of Lehman Brothers to actually having the world, or at least the American financial system, collapse. And I think that would have been a major economic catastrophe for the rest of the world. We must pray we never have that lesson to live. But it surely is an indication of how closely associated and interdependent we are. Another thing, of course, is that the world is no longer so state-centric. One of the things I'm sure you've experienced, as I have, is how many non-state actors, if you like, international organizations, informal networks, individuals connected with one another and acting together across boundaries. How important this has become in the world we live in. It's very evident in the human rights area. It's evident in the area of environment. It's evident across a whole spectrum of issues that we are all concerned about. And I think it's not new in the world we live in, but the extent and the dynamism of these networks and relationships are surely new in the world we know. Power is still important. There were articles several years ago, you may have read some of them, about the end of the state. The state is not ended and it's not going to end. The state is still, states are still the major actors in the world. But military force, as I think the United States has demonstrated in the last 4 or 5 or 6 years, is not enough to control events, but still important. What I think is the integration and the knowledge that we all have in real time from the internet has made, I think, if you like, a new kind of power, or at least has made a kind of power more prominent, the power to disrupt, negative power. The terrorist groups or criminal groups, for example, cannot, I think, change the nature of international politics, but they can disrupt things. And we're all very vulnerable. I mean, we're not only vulnerable, it seems to me, in terms of financial disruption, which we can do without the aid of, obviously, of terrorists or criminal groups, but also energy transfer or transportation or communication. I think if you think about it, we are vulnerable to disruption as we've never been before because we are so dependent on other actors in this world. So I think force has become, at least in the current situation, less compelling, not irrelevant, but less compelling, and negative power, if you like, more compelling. And I think the experience of the United States in Iraq and now in Afghanistan, to me at least, is a demonstration of that, that principle, that force is not enough, and one country using force cannot always or even often achieve its goals in other parts of the world. New challenges. I want to talk a little bit about something we perhaps don't talk that much about in our classes on international relations, but is very much a part of the world we live in, and that involves demography. And it involves demography, population, in several ways. Population continues to grow. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute. But population plus prosperity means rapidly increasing demands for resource use. One telling factor is that if you are having, let's say, bread or grain, rice, if you like, for dinner, great. You might, if you're really hungry, eat a whole pound of it. If you are having beef for dinner, for every pound of beef, you are eating 8 pounds of grain, because that's what it takes to fatten up a cow. 4 pounds of grain is what we use to feed chickens, to create a pound of chicken meat. And as income rises, the demand for protein, higher quality protein, also rises. And we're seeing that, as we expected to see eventually, in China and in other countries of the world where income is going up. And that puts pressure on resources. Fish, big pressure on wild fish, as you know, worldwide. And I could go on. Perhaps the element, the thing that is under most pressure in this part of the world is water. We are worried about food. The world produces enough food to feed itself right now, but obviously it's vulnerable to food shortages and sudden surges in food prices, as happened just about a year ago. But all of this leads us to climate change. And in many ways, Lamia, I think that may be the greatest challenge for your generation. And we're not helping you much, I'm afraid, in dealing with that challenge, although hopefully we're awakening to its danger. So population growth, we're nearing 7 billion, is important. But the other thing that's important is what's happening within populations and within countries. As you probably know, I'm going to show you some interesting graphs on this. Populations in the rich countries of the world are aging. Not all of them, but many of them. Populations are aging. The workforce to sustain that aging population is declining. And that opens up a problem. It's an economic problem, but it's also an opportunity and another problem. It's an opportunity for immigration. And that opportunity has been seized by many in poorer countries to move to richer countries, sometimes legally, sometimes not. But that problem, in turn, creates problems of identity. And that may be one of the really important issues in the future of our globe and how we manage issues of identity. Let me show you some pictures. Here's our population growth. It's, you know, I don't plan to be around in 2050. 9 billion people is an awfully crowded place. And Lamia, I hope you guys can fix this and create a world that is prosperous for all of those 9 billion people and one that isn't consuming itself. It's going to be a challenge, I think. But let's look at the demographics within countries. These are, I think, interesting pyramid graphs of population. Each bar is an age group, and so the bottom bar is 0 to 5, and the top one, which is pretty unoccupied in most places, is 100. But they're growing too. The UK is experiencing this challenge of an aging demography, an aging population. Italy, who would have thought the Italians would have a hard time reproducing themselves? But there we are. The Italians are having one of the biggest problems in in the demographic pyramid. China is in this situation as well, as you can see, and you can also see the difference in numbers of boys and girls, the girls being on the right hand and the boys being on the left hand. But you can see the aging population in China. The younger part of that pyramid is narrowing. Brazil, starting to show the same thing. India, even India. Nigeria shows a much more traditional graph of a rapidly growing population with a large number of youth. The United States is an outlier among developed countries. It's not growing rapidly, its population is not growing rapidly, but it is growing. It's not aging in quite the manner of Italy or the UK. And then there is that real outlier, Qatar. If you see up here, the left-hand bars are clearly, I think, immigrant workers. And the right hand, probably, especially in the lower bars, will give you, I think, a better sense of the Qatari population, or those living more permanently here. And that's not growing very rapidly either, interestingly. I should say this presents a problem for Georgetown. We want more Qataris in our program. If you could please send us your children, we would be very appreciative. So, I think these are interesting graphs. I think they exhibit a problem that we can then see in other ways, a problem of immigration. The United States has the largest number of immigrants, obviously, many legal, many illegal. Most of them, I think, from Mexico and further south. But you can see some of the other countries that have absolutely large numbers. And then the countries with the highest share of migrants in their population are here in the Gulf. And Qatar is not on that list only because I think it has less than 1 million people in it. But this is another exhibit of one of the things we're looking at. You know, I've been fascinated. Let's go back, actually. Can I go back? We're going to have to look at that in a minute because I'm going to start changing this stuff. There we go. I've traveled a lot in Europe, and I remember one trip I made. I went from Copenhagen to Lisbon, and I happened to have dinners with people in both places. I was surprised at the conversation in both dinners. It was about identity. It was about immigration. These were either Danes or Portuguese. People worrying about the others, people from other countries who had very different cultural patterns and other aspects living in their country, and worrying about how they were going to integrate, if they were going to integrate, should they integrate, should we not have fewer immigrants. And I took those conversations as a reflection of a growing unease in Europe with identity of countries and populations. And I think that issue is only going to grow because the Europeans need immigration. And this is more, I think, telling even in Japan. They need integration, and there is a push-pull bringing it in because there are jobs. Now, I don't want to make propaganda for the United States, but I do think that we have some, and many, I suppose, nativist views about immigration. But our country has never been based on an ethnicity, it's based on an idea. And I think that has eased the immigration problem in the United States, which is very real and is found everywhere, even in small places. But even in the United States, you will hear conversations about identity. It's my hope that these conversations do not become sources of conflict in societies. But I honestly don't know how many countries experiencing very large and permanent immigration, legal or illegal, are going to grapple with the problem of identity. And that may be one of the other issues, Lamia, that your generation will be wrestling with, and I hope successfully. I don't want to say anything much about the impact of the Great Recession, which is what I'm beginning to hear it called. We don't know if we're coming out of it. We hope. But then if you listen to Bloomberg, you get a little depressed, at least from some of their folks. My own sense is this is a temporary, maybe not a year or two, but at least we're, it seems to me, poised to return to our growth. So, what are the global challenges in the New World Order? You know, that interesting question is who's going to manage this, or what is going to manage it, or how is order going to be managed in a world with a highly integrated economy and very interdependent societies and polities? In the past, in the state-centric systems and others, we've had empires and national hegemonies and alliances. It doesn't seem like that's what's happening right now. And we must look, I think, elsewhere, because I don't think power is distributed in a way, at least today, that permits empires and hegemony. We look at the UN. You know, the UN has created a lot of specialized agencies over the years to try to manage things like the environment. Not always very successful. We go to New York and we talk a lot in the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, and it's very important. But it doesn't always or often solve our problems, and our problems are large. My own view is that the European Union, despite the Lisbon Treaty, which has just been passed by the Irish and now comes into operation, is still fragmented. It's very difficult for the Europeans to get together and take active leadership. This may be a very sort of narrow-minded American view, but it's one that is widely shared. Take leadership in some of these issues. The United States, it seems to me, has another problem, and that is the weight of domestic politics. You could say that we're a little narcissistic, or maybe it's a gravitational pull. I'm not sure which analogy to use. But if you take the whole continent that we live in, with 300 million people, we tend to focus on ourselves more than anything else. And if you note the debates, if you follow them at all in Washington, over recent months have been on domestic political issues, although Afghanistan is becoming increasingly prominent. But what a president of the United States can do, except in times of extreme emergency, is not very much. A president of the United States cannot easily take international leadership when it involves actions by the US Congress. And it doesn't matter what party is in the White House and what party is in the Congress, it's always a challenge, as it is right now. We're looking at, I suspect, a president who is going to go to Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, without anything much to say. I don't know anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if he decided maybe it was better to stay home. Presidents don't like to go and be embarrassed. So I think we are often very much constrained by our own political system. Some people have likened us to a Gulliver, a large entity that's tied down by lots of little constraints. But that's a reality, and frankly, I suspect the rest of the world is probably relieved by that reality, because of course if we could move very quickly and do things very quickly, we might do things that people don't like. In fact, we even managed to do that without constraints sometimes. What about the G7 or the G20? I think, and now the G20 has in theory replaced the G7. The G7 never really did very much. If you watch them, they got together once a year and they made very high-toned commitments to make the world a better place, and then went home, and nothing much happened. And it's important to talk, for heads of state to talk to one another, although as a former government official, My job, and all of our jobs, was never let your boss get in a room alone with another leader, because they might come up with something really wacky that you then had to go home and undo. But that didn't much happen, it seems to me, in the G7. Important to talk. The G20 is larger. I think it's going to be even harder to come up with things, but we'll see. Not, though, it seems to me, a very likely source of international leadership and governance. If I had to look around to say, well, where is leadership and governance, global governance and management going to come from? My guess is in smaller groups, in the kind of groups we see growing and forming even today. International groupings, and often including state and non-state actors that deal with specific issues. The World Trade Organization that deals with trade. A variety of climate change organizations. They may not deal effectively with climate change, but at least they contribute. A number of organizations in the area of water. Water is going to be a difficult international management issue. It already is. Regional organizations that have, it seems to me, picked up some influence. Perhaps the Gulf Cooperation Council is a good example. I actually think the Organization of American States has some influence in what happens in the region. The African Union, perhaps a little less so, but I think we're seeing more of these, and I think they may be a direction for the future. But I didn't say I was going to have solutions. I only said I was going to give you problems, and so that's where we are. Challenges, security in an integrated world. We've mentioned the vulnerabilities we have already. Managing political change inside countries. That's a challenge always. Economic prosperity, we're going to have a more regulated world, or at least an attempt at it, to keep the contagion that we've just experienced from the crazy financial arrangements that went on for so long and created the housing bubble in the United States. I think there's at least an inclination or an impulse to try to govern and regulate international financial policies more. Managing immigration and identity, a challenge, as I said, and then managing global problems. Climate change comes to mind. Health comes to mind too, of course, because we hear and note a great deal of health problems like HIV/AIDS, but it does seem to me that climate change is something that is facing all of us, the consequences of it.